Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sarah Gomez, and I'm the Associate Director of the Environmental Studies Program. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Hoke Cunningham Environmental Lectures, which are generously sponsored by two alumni, Daphne Hoke Cunningham and Roland Hoke, and their families. And today's event is also co-sponsored by the Office of Sustainability and Tisch College for Civic Life. I am really excited to see such a great turnout for our first regular in-person meeting with food after almost 3 years. So thank you everybody for coming, and I hope to see you in the next coming weeks. If you want to have this on your radar, you want to receive weekly alerts, please sign up for the newsletter. We'll be passing a sign-up sheet. If you have signed up in the past, you don't need to do that again. But if you've never signed up for it, I encourage you to do so. You will have two options. One, to sign up for the weekly student newsletter. So if you're a student and want to get announcements about environmental internships, jobs, events, and things like that, sign up for that one. If you just want to get alerts about the talks, you can also do that. So just please indicate that in the sign up sheet. Oh, something I haven't said in 3 years is now that we have food again, we would like to encourage people to bring their own plates and their own utensils and their own water bottles so we can minimize waste. And yeah, so just remember that for next week. The lectures are typically recorded, not always. They are typically live streamed, not always. Today's is both being live streamed and recorded. And if you want to rewatch it or share it with a friend, you'll find it in our website probably today or tomorrow. For the people in the online audience, if you have questions, you can put it in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them at the end of the talk. And now it's my pleasure to restart a tradition that we used to have in these events back when we had audience in the room, which is to open the floor for announcements from the audience. I know that you have one for sure, and there are others. So before we introduce today's speakers, let's do that.
Okay, my name is Shoshana Daly, and I'm working with Fridays for Future. We're having the global climate strike next Friday, and Tufts is, Fridays for Future Boston is partnering with TCA to have a protest outside of the campus center, the lower patio. It's going to be at 11 a.m. We're going to have music and speakers and chants. Our demands are divestment, and also that when in the search for a new president, that they include someone who is climate conscious and has that as a priority. I have stickers so you can spread the word if you want to get after, and also posters. So yeah, we hope to see you there.
Tina, you have an announcement? Oh, yes, no, yes.
Yeah, my name is Tina Woolston. I'm the Sustainability Program Director, and I just want to remind everyone that Green Fund applications are due on October 1st. The Green Fund is a $40,000 fund that students, faculty, or staff can apply to support projects on campus, sustainability projects on campus that are led by the applicant themselves. You can talk to me or anyone in my office if you have any questions.
Thank you, Tina. Any other announcements? Do you want to say something about the lunch on Monday? Yes.
But I also work for the Office of Sustainability, and we have a... Sure. I'm Anne, and I work for the Office of Sustainability. And we're going to be having a lunch next Monday from 12 to 1 on the academic quad, welcoming everyone back in person in our environmental community on campus. So we welcome students, faculty, staff to come stop by. We're going to have a free taco bar. So that's a big plug. It's going to be a vegetarian taco bar, along with a few kind of 1-minute intros to some of our different offices and programs on campus. So if you want to join us for that, that'd be awesome. We'll be there from 12 to 1 on Monday.
Thank you. And any other announcements? If not, don't go too far, Anne, because she's today's speaker. But she's going to first be introduced by Tina Wilson from the Office of Sustainability. Thank you, Tina.
Great, thank you. So I introduced myself already, but I've been walking around patting myself on the back lately because I hired such amazing people this summer. Jen's also in the office, a new employee from November. So Anne comes to us from Brandeis University, where she's finishing up her PhD, which is the work she's going to be talking about today. So the PhD dissertation that she's been working on every morning before work, it focuses on the way young climate activists mobilize storytelling and manage emotions around climate change. She graduated from Siena College with a degree in sociology and a certificate in community development. While at Siena, she spent 4 years as an AmeriCorps member through the Bonner Service Leaders Program. She says here in her bio that she loves exploring new places, spending time outside, and trying new restaurants or recipes. And I can tell you from personal experience that she loves really spicy food. And it's always looking for that. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Anne Ward to come and speak to you guys.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. I'm really excited to share a little bit about my dissertation research with y'all. Tina did a really good job sort of introducing me, but my background is a sociologist. I was an undergrad sociology major and then went to grad school at Brandeis for a PhD in sociology. The beauty of sociology is, though, you don't have to be a sociologist to do sociology. So I just want to give that plug. I also work here in the Office of Sustainability. I have the privilege of working with our eco reps on campus and also working with faculty and staff on sustainability across the campus. But like Tina said, my side gig is currently finishing my dissertation. So my dissertation focuses on young climate activists and what I'm calling the culture of cultivated optimism. I'm going to dig into a little bit of what that word salad means as I move through the presentation. But I encourage you to kind of keep questions in mind. I'll point to things that I can't fully explain in this talk, but would be happy to talk a little bit more about. And one of those things is if you're a student here who's thinking about going to grad school, thinking about going and getting a PhD, I love being a resource for undergrads thinking about that path. So feel free to contact me if you have any questions about what that looks like, no matter what your discipline is. I have friends in all different disciplines that I can sort of point you in their direction. So that's of interest to you. I'm always happy to be a help in that space. So let's see if my little clicker works and where I have to point it. It might not. It's okay. I'm just going to advance the slides myself. Okay, this may be a little weird because I'm going to have to go back and forth to advance, but it's fine. So to give a really quick overview, this dissertation project focuses broadly on young climate activists in the northeastern United States. So I keep that intentionally vague and broad. I don't really name the organizations that I'm looking at, but I'm looking at northeastern climate activists, young people who identify as climate activists and consider themselves to be climate activists. My project is an 18-month ethnographic project. Ethnography is a particular method used by sociologists and anthropologists and a lot of different social scientists to try to understand how things happen in patterned ways. So has anybody taken a class where they learn about ethnography? I'm just curious. Yeah, a few. Yay, awesome. One of the things I'll say about getting a degree in social sciences or in any of these kind of interdisciplinary fields is one of the best things you can do is take methods classes. I use my methods training all the time in my job right now with interviews and focus groups and stuff like that. So as an undergrad, I really encourage you to take methods classes. It really helps post-school. But my method, my training is in ethnography. So I did 11 months in the field pre-COVID, 7 months in the field post-COVID, which I'll explain in a minute, and then about 40 interviews and content analysis of tons of different organizational documents, from emails to training guides to Instagram posts. So I'm kind of taking these 3 different approaches: interviews, observation, and content analysis, and triangulating my data to make an ethnography. So that's my method. I think it's really important when someone's telling you what they know, you ask how they know what they know. So that's my form of how I know what I know. I will just flag something kind of wonky happened when I was in the field. The wonky thing happened to all of us, which is we experienced a global pandemic. So I started in the field in May of 2019. or 18, 19, and then 19, and then was in the field until December of 2020. So right in the middle of my field work, actually right around the 50th Earth Day, which was a really big mobilization point for a lot of activists, things turned to be online, which was really complicated and made my data set a little bit funky, but we work through it, we persevere. A colleague and I actually published a paper about this. If you're interested in what this experience was like, I'm happy to talk about it a little bit later. But that is something that's unique to my data set, and not everybody sort of has that in their data set, that sort of global shift and fragmentation that I experienced. I do want to share really quickly my personal connections to the project, sort of situate myself in the project, because, we talk about thinking about your positionality and who you are and what that does to the research you do. So I got to grad school, I was 22. And I was personally really afraid of what my future looked like. I was really not feeling great about climate change, and I wasn't sure what it meant for me. And because my brain works the way it works, I was like, I want to figure out how people deal with this, because I can't be the only one that's really worried about climate change. There has to be other people out there that are worried about it as well. And that meant kind of exploring the different people that deal with climate change on a day-to-day. That's not just activists. I just ended up studying activists because that's my area of specialty. But at its core, this project was like an intellectual sort of exploration of my own personal struggles and concerns about what the future looks like. So I don't often think as academics we situate ourselves in our work, but there's very real reason I did this work, and it was sort of to answer a question that I was having myself. So my primary question that I'm dealing with in my work is, how do young climate activists collectively process emotions about climate change? And to sort of explain what I mean by this, I need to do a little bit of a literature review. And I'm sorry, this is a little bit academic and sort of some of the baseline stuff that I just want to explain before we dive into the more fun stuff. But I draw from literature that's considered to be social movements literature. So social movement scholars consider emotion to be constituted by shared meanings rather than only physiological states. And this is really important because this is how I differentiate myself from psychologists who study emotions. We're all working together. We're not combative. It's not I do things better, they do things better. We're all trying to solve similar problems, but we have different methods for engaging with questions about emotions in sociology than you do in a psychology class. So in sociology, we're interested in emotions at a group level. So how do people as groups deal with and navigate their emotions? And how are those experiences conditioned by group norms? Whereas a psychologist might have you in a lab in a neutral environment where there's not other stimuli to sort of take direction away from one particular thing they're studying. I'm studying people in the world doing their thing, living their life, and trying to make sense of how this happens at that level. So, different methods, similar questions, but that's one really important difference when you see what I'm talking about today. I'm not necessarily interested in, pinpointing one particular emotion on a neurocognitive scale or on a neurocognitive map, or, thinking about how I feel. I'm thinking about the way we all talk about emotions as collective groups. So scholars in social movement studies have studied things like the construction and reinforcement of collective identities and how that's connected to emotions. They've also studied how people use emotions to recruit activists into their movements, and how you can mobilize emotions to kind of further your cause as an activist. So how people mobilize emotions to get what they want, to have their needs met, to engage with the causes that they're working on. They've also studied the role of specific emotions like love, shock, fear, and shame. So this is something that social movement scholars who study activists have started to unpack. It's actually still a relatively understudied field. And especially in social movements, it usually only focuses on movements like the women's movement or the LGBTQ movement, which is sort of connected to this way that we gender emotions, which I'm sort of pushing back against, that emotions happen in all spaces and we shouldn't just be studying them in the women's movement. So that's part of what I'm pushing back with in my work. So this is where we get to the actual concept that I'm trying to explain. which is this idea of an emotional culture. So this is the primary thing I'm trying to unpack when I think about young climate activists and the way that they deal with emotions about climate change. So what's really important to know is that emotions have multiple functions in social movement activism. Emotions can be used, like I said, to draw people in. They can be used to make a claim. They can be used to get people's attention, insiders and outsiders. But what I think is really important and that often gets missed is emotions also can be constraining. So a lot of times in social movement scholarship, they say, you know, people mobilize this emotion in this way. They're able to use emotion in this way. But I argue in some ways emotion pushes back and you're only able to do what's acceptable within your emotional culture. So an emotional culture includes expectations about how members should feel about themselves and dominant groups, as well as how they should manage and express feelings evoked in their day-to-day encounters with dominant groups. So I think what's really important here is this management component and what it means. So you have your individual affective states, like the way things are happening sort of internally. When you are emoting outwardly, you're kind of managing that emotion process in a particular way that matches what your emotional culture sort of conditions you. And I like to think of it, emotional culture, like we're all, this is such a weird example. We're all pickles and we all live in a brine, and the brine that you all live in is like the emotional culture that shapes what you're able to do. So to get some technical stuff out of the way, I go by a definition of culture that describes culture as people's shared meanings and the vehicles through which they express those meanings. It's really important to define what I mean by culture because it's a word people just throw out, like has no meaning. Culture can be anything. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about culture. So emotional culture then is the emotional components of these shared meanings and the vehicles in which they process and express the emotions. I like to give an example of an emotional culture just to sort of concretize what's a little bit theoretical and up in the air. Right now, we are in an academic space, right? So what sociologists do is we take the familiar and make it strange. So things that you don't think about that sort of condition your everyday life. So right now we're in an academic space. If I were to start sobbing, it would feel odd. People would be like, why is she sobbing? This isn't what I'm expecting. This doesn't really feel right. Maybe you'd feel, did anyone get that like weird sweaty feeling when someone does something to make them uncomfortable? You would recognize that that's not normal for this space. If I were to start screaming at Sierra for just existing, no reason at all, it would be very odd. You'd be like, this isn't how this is supposed to go. That's because there's an emotional culture that conditions the way we operate in this academic space. I was actually thinking about this today. So I teach at Brandeis, and I think I might even argue that the emotional culture at Tufts in academic spaces is different than the emotional culture that I've experienced at Brandeis. So these are little micro differences. There's broad emotional cultures that exist on this kind of grand scale when we think about an academic space. But when you get down to the details, there are these little differences that you start to notice. And that's one of the things I love so much about my work is I started to notice that some climate activists that belong to my group did this, but you look at another group and that's actually not what they're doing. So it's not necessarily, you know, this kind of overarching thing. There are nuances in emotional culture that are interesting to study. So moving along, what am I trying to understand? I gave you a lot of theory. I gave you a lot of literature, trying to get you to sort of get where I'm coming from, what my perspectives are, but what exactly do I want to know? So I want to know how climate activists manage their emotions about climate change. That is my primary question. I'm also interested in the emotional culture that I just defined. I want to figure out, how do I understand it? What are some of the patterns that I see when I look at emotional processing at this collective level? And is there anything that's happening over and over again that kind of constitutes this culture that signals to me? The third thing that I don't talk about in this talk, but that I'm like intellectually obsessed with right now is, where does youth climate activism fit within the larger environmental movement and the broader climate movement? I have a kind of a personal, axe to grind, for lack of a better term, that we conflate environment and climate, especially in movement studies. We just like use them interchangeably without interrogating what those differences mean in practice. So this is my chapter 5 of my dissertation. I'm like knee deep in it right now. Not going to talk about it today, but if you're interested in sort of these differences between environment and climate and thinking about where youth climate activism fits within the broader environmental movement, happy to answer questions about that. I'm still sort of exploring that myself. So we're going to do a quick breakdown of my argument. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of my activists told me about how they feel, and then do a little bit of sharing about how storytelling is connected to this. And then I'll open it up for questions. I want to make sure we have time to sort of have a dialogue. But my primary argument is that the activists that I study, these young climate activists in a Northeast city, operate within an emotional culture of cultivated optimism. I went through a million different versions of this phrase. Emotional culture of cultivated optimism is super word salady, but I'll explain why I landed there and why I thought the word cultivated was so important. So the other piece of this is that the emotional culture shapes the way social movement activists deal with their emotions collectively. So it's not just that the case that activists are able to go into any movement space and emote in any way that they want. In fact, emotional culture conditions what you're able to say, how you're able to emote, and structures your emotions in ways you might actually not be super aware of. We'll get into how emotional culture isn't law at the end. That's not to say it dictates everything, but it shapes emotional experiences in really interesting ways. So this particular emotional culture that I'm sort of unpacking, looking at this movement group, is something that I'm calling cultivated optimism. And it's fueled by the idea that action is a source of hope and is an antidote to negative emotions. So that's really important. Action is a source of hope and can be an antidote to negative emotions like fear. I had one of my activists quite literally say, action is the antidote. That's coming from their words. And that's a big component of how this emotional culture is constructed. What I want to be clear is that it's not that activists aren't afraid or angry or scared. In fact, they are, and you'll see in my quotes that they very much are and aren't afraid to talk about it. But through this emotional culture, they're able to manage those fears in ways that kind of work in a collaborative emotional processing tool that they enact, one being storytelling. The thing that I want to say here is a big piece of the cultivated optimism that I'm finding is that activists validate these negative feelings, not just push through them. They acknowledge them, they hear them, they see them, but they are able to transform them into action that connects to hope. So this is sort of an image that I did this morning. I was trying to make it, like, for our visual learners in the house, trying to make it sort of processual so you could see what I'm talking about here. What I love so much about my work, and I had so much fun doing my field work, I kind of skipped over this when I talked about my methods, but I met like the coolest, most exciting, passionate, amazing youth climate activists. I had such a good time. It was like the most fun 18 months that I could ever have imagined. I know so many scholars who are like so ready to get out of the field by the time that they're done. My advisors had to like rip me out of the field. They were like, you cannot do this any longer. I had such a great time. And one of the things I noticed over and over again was this pattern, and it kept happening. I kept seeing it. I heard it when they talked to me about their emotions. I heard it when they talked to each other about their emotions. I heard it when they told stories. I heard it when they trained one another. It was everywhere, to the point where I was like, I can't ignore this anymore. This is a pattern I keep seeing over and over and over again. So the pattern of this kind of expression is, first, people talk about their fear and their anger and their sadness. It's put on the table and then it's validated. It's agreed upon in these spaces that everybody has these emotions. We can talk about whether or not the emotions look the same for everybody in a minute, but there's this general understanding in this community that I'm studying that they all feel this way, but that they need to transition those fears into action that generates hope. So it's sort of this idea, the negative emotions exist, but through action, they're able to link to hope. So Part of this is why I named it Cultivated Optimism, because it's not just like unrestrained hope. Like, it's not just like, we're super hopeful for the future. This is so good. We're so excited. I think anybody that does climate activism would sort of really push back against that and say, no, this is a very chaotic time to be alive. And that's totally fine. It's very much a cultivated process. They work very hard as a group to move through fear and anger and sadness towards hope and action. And I actually just saw the other day a quote from somebody. It was in like the New York Times, and it was basically like this personified, and it wasn't from an activist of the group I study, but it's just interesting how, you know, my study is now about 2 years old, which is insane and makes me feel like I should really be done with the dissertation, but it's almost 2 years old, and it's still something I'm sort of seeing in the field when I'm peripherally looking. So to let some of my activists speak for themselves, which I think is really important, I want to pull out some quotes from some interviews that I did that just kind of highlight what this emotional culture looks like when people are talking about it. So I will say, I would argue the most useful part of my data collection was observation, because I needed to watch this happen in practice. I couldn't just hear people speak about it. I needed to watch what was happening, how they were negotiating it in practice. So this is like a verbalization of it, but we'll talk about what it actually looked like in operations in a minute. So Harper, who at the time was 22, she had just graduated college, had just gotten her first job, had been super engaged in divestment in undergrad, and actually went on to work at an environmental nonprofit, but was a member of the movement organization I studied. She said, at times, yeah, this work overwhelms me and I feel really hopeless and helpless and like, wow, we just aren't actually going to be able to do enough. But then I remember it's just very inspirational to see everything that's going around the country and the world, and the climate strikes are one huge example of that. Millions of people turned out for a global climate strike in over 10,000 cities in this entire world, and things are happening, you know? And I was saying at the beginning, I'm getting nostalgic because one of the biggest events I went to during my time in the field was the September 2019 climate strike. It's really exciting to see that this is happening again. I hope people draw the same level of inspiration from that they did during that time. So I'm excited to kind of see that play out. And I'm really happy someone's doing something about it at Tufts. But here you see it really laid out pretty clearly. She's overwhelmed. She sometimes feels helpless and hopeless. Wow, we aren't going to be able to do enough. She acknowledges it. She's not hiding that part. But then she remembers it's inspirational to see other people acting. She grabs hope. She channels other people's action into personal hope. And we hear this over and over again. This is where they find inspiration, action that they're engaging in and action that others are engaging in. So we also, sorry, I'm talking out of the mic. We also have Mia, who's 18. Mia was one of the people I talked to via Zoom. We were on a Zoom interview. And when I asked about how she kind of deals with different things with the climate crisis and sort of how she's processing what's going on around her, Mia said she takes action. Honestly, I feel like if I sat around and did nothing while the world fell apart, I would never be able to live with myself. And I think taking action gives me hope because you get to see how many other people feel the same way you do. And you realize that when you work together, you're not alone. And if everyone works together, we can stop this and we can create a better world and a livable future. So similarly, we see Mia starting out here. She's not denying that there's bad things happening. If she sat around while the world fell apart, she couldn't live with herself. She's nodding to the fact that she sees that the world is falling apart. But in taking action with others, she's able to generate hope. She's realizing she's not alone, and she kind of sees a future for herself and for other people who are taking this action with her. The thing that I want to note in Mia's quote that's super interesting and sort of speaks to this structuring element of emotional culture is the way she says, you get to see how many other people feel the same way that you do. So she is assuming, and this is part of the emotional culture, part of what it gives people is this sense of collective feeling that everybody feels the same way that she does. And that actually gives her comfort. That's part of why she's able to keep going. What's really interesting to note, and again, where this is kind of a fun way to think about emotions at this collective level, is it's definitely not the case, actually, that they all feel the same way. They, in fact, might have similar emotional states or understandings of their emotional states, but some people are angry at fossil fuel executives, some people are angry at their parents, some people are angry at their neighbor. Like, the anger or the fear or the sadness is not always directed in the same way, but through the emotional culture of cultivated optimism, they're able to kind of create this sense of shared emotion that allows them to feel like they have camaraderie and a space for their emotions that aren't all the same, but are able to be interpreted as the same through some processes that happen in emotional spaces. I'm going to talk about one of those processes in a minute, which is storytelling, that really facilitates this idea that we feel the same way, even though it's not always the case that that's exactly true. So this is really important. I wanted to ask the question, is emotional culture law? And by that, I mean, can emotional culture change? Is it like, that structure and agency debate? Like, are we all just cogs in the machine being churned through a wheel, or do we have agency to make our own decisions? I think this sort of comes to that same thing. Is emotional culture structuring everything that we do? Is it influencing all the ways we express our emotions in our different contexts? I would argue that that's a little bit of a complicated question, and that instead we need to think about emotional culture as not being static. So I don't see emotional culture as law. I think it's structuring and it conditions what's possible, but it's not law, and it in fact can change. And this is really important because this is part of how it's created, right? Emotional culture doesn't just exist. It's something that people collectively decide to build through processes and action. And there's ways in which that's a little more complicated than how I just put it. But for simplicity's sake, it is something that is built and it can be changed. It's not static at all. Things that were normal in those spaces when I was there may actually, I could go back and see, this is a difference. This is how this has changed. So I argue that it's constantly being reinforced and also sometimes challenged by activists as they operate within movement spaces. So these things are constantly shifting and changing. I think one of the most impactful ways that emotional culture in the organization that I studied was reinforced was through storytelling. So in my dissertation, I'm really taking like a triangle approach to thinking about climate activism. I'm interested in emotion, storytelling, and culture. And I see all these things coming together in the way that storytelling reinforces the emotional culture of this group. So there are three ways that I watch that happen in practice. And I call them my 3 R's, which is kind of silly, but it's to rehearse, to recognize, and to reframe. And I'll explain what all of those things mean. So activists actually train one another pretty specifically on how to tell stories in this movement group. This movement group sees stories as really central to what they do. It's a part of who they are. It's a part of their identity in the climate movement. Saying that, you might get a sense of who they are. They're pretty clear that storytelling is what they do. And they train one another how to tell stories. They also train one another how to recognize good stories. And this is what's really important. What makes a good story is reinforced by this emotional culture. So they're training one another how to tell good stories and recognize good stories. And the concept of good, you see, is very much influenced by the emotional culture that they're operating in. And I saw story after story after story that followed that metric of fear is real. This is a challenge I face. I'm afraid. This is something I had to overcome. But I found my people. Now I act and feel hopeful. I saw that over and over and over again in stories that these activists were telling, and they explicitly teach each other to tell stories that are structured in this particular way. So they teach each other to tell the stories, and then they teach each other to recognize them, which means when I'm up here, say I'm a climate activist, I tell my story, it fits within the kind of emotional norms of the emotional culture. People recognize it, give me snaps, give me audible nods. There's an activity that they do with each other called resonance, where it's like, I'm really with you when, or I feel it in my body when. So you're directing the teller to the parts that worked. You're directing the teller to what was good in the story that matches along the ways that this group expects members to talk about emotions. So those are kind of interrelated, how to recognize and how to tell. There's a third part of what happens happens in the reinforcement of the emotional culture of cultivated optimism, which is they reframe stories that don't quite fit. So this is where it's a question of, is emotional culture law? What happens when someone does something that doesn't fit that mold, that doesn't do those three sort of steps that I talked about, where it's validating sadness, anger, talking about action, and linking that action to hope? What I witnessed was people reframe each other as a way to kind of regroup and reiterate what is an appropriate way to express emotions, which is really interesting. One of my favorite examples of reframing was an activist who started reframing herself in an interview where she was like, I'm really afraid, but it's really, really bad to act from fear. So I have to constantly remind myself to not be afraid. And I'm kind of watching her reframe her own response about how she doesn't want to kind of link her fear to her activism. She wants to link her activism to her hope. So that was one example of her reframing herself in a conversation. The other reframe I'll talk about is actually a story, and then I'm going to wrap up after this, that I thought was really interesting. So, and it kind of highlights the power of storytelling in this reinforcement process. So in August of 2020, there were really bad wildfires all across the West Coast. It was a problem in California, it was a problem in Oregon, and it was kind of happening at the same time that the election was happening, the Joe Biden, Donald Trump election, and also while the pandemic was going on. So that was about the end of my field work, and a lot of stuff happened at that time because we're dealing with like competing crises at once. So I'm on the Zoom call. It's not in person because we're all online. And an activist is brought up on the big screen, as we all were at that time, to talk about her experience. And she starts off the story in a way that I grew to expect, right? She talks about the redwoods and how important the redwoods were to her experience growing up, how they're connected to her family. She made it really personal. It was about her. And then she transitioned to how devastating it was to watch the redwoods burn. She talked about how she cried watching footage of the place that she loved and grew up and spent time in burn down. And again, kind of doing what I was normally accustomed to, which is transitioning to what they call a challenge moment. So that's the challenge moment, is dealing with this devastating fire that she's dealing with. She keeps going. And as I'm listening to the story, I'm realizing I'm not hearing a link to hope. And I'm like, this is odd, because usually by now somebody said something about action and hope. I'm not used to this pattern. Like, I'm so used to this other pattern that I've seen. And so she finishes and she says, I'm sick of COVID and I'm sick of smoke. I just want my life back. And hands the mic, like the proverbial Zoom mic, back to the MC. She's like, thanks, back to you. And in my field notes, which are what you take when you're doing ethnography, when you're doing participant observation, I was like, whoa, this is one of the least kind of hope-centric stories I've ever heard. What will the MC do? I really wanted to know what he was going to do. I'm like, is he just going to let this go? What's going to happen? What the MC did, I'll just call him Alex. Alex was like, thank you so much. I just want to validate everything that you're talking about. It's horrible. We're so upset. We need to mobilize so that we can have control over our future. And I just want to thank you for providing us with a story of hope. There was literally not a single thing in that story that was hope. It was very emotional. She was very upset, and it was totally a valid story. I'm not invalidating that story. It's just, it didn't fit within their emotional culture of cultivated optimism. So he didn't sanction her. He didn't say, this is wrong, you shouldn't have done this. He just reframed it, said, look, this is an example of how we can mobilize for the election and, bring awareness to the problems of climate change. He reframed the story that she was telling to fit in with this emotional culture. So I like that example because it shows emotional culture isn't law. We're not stuck doing things in the way that kind of meets that sort of equation that I put forward, but it is structuring, and it does affect what we're able to do and say in certain spaces. And when we don't meet expectations of the emotional culture, we can be reframed. And in this case, this activist was reframed. So really quick conclusion, I just want to say, once again, the youth climate activists that I study operated within an emotional culture of cultivated optimism. It is an emotional culture where activists hear and validate negative emotions like fear, sadness, and anger, but in collective spaces are required to move through those emotions and tie it to hope and action. I observed this through storytelling particularly, and one of my favorite sort of like new findings that I'm sort of still exploring in my writing is that the emotional culture is not universal. This culture of cultivated optimism is not universal across the entire climate movement or even the youth climate movement, which is something that activists that I studied actually expressed. They said they wanted to create their own spaces to process their emotions because they felt like X other organization didn't kind of jive with how they understood things, and that I witnessed in my own observations. So I'm sort of still unpacking that. But again, it speaks to this idea that emotional culture is considered, we can think of it as an umbrella, but when we zoom into the micro, which is what I do as an ethnographer, there are nuances and changes even within the climate movement. So I just want to say this is kind of the boring theoretical takeaway, which is that emotional culture of a movement group influences collective emotional practices and impacts mobilization. But what I really want to say, and this is like my, I feel like I've talked about two axes to grind. One was the difference between climate and environment. The other is this thing that happened to me the other day, which I was in a Zoom meeting with like a very prominent climate kind of like in a government space. They do climate work, climate policy. And they were sort of like chiding environmental activists and climate activists for feeling bad. They were sort of saying like, we can't talk about fear. We shouldn't be talking about fear. We should be thinking and talking about hope. And I think from an external perspective, I understand that, right? Like externally, you don't want to scare people away who aren't involved, who don't do climate activism, who are maybe part of that sort of apathetic group that's not against you, but not with you. You don't want to kind of alienate them by highlighting and centering fear. But why it bothered me was because it was actually about how activists shouldn't be talking about fear. And I just want to say, anyone in the room that's a young person or a climate activist or engaged in any way with climate, I just want to validate that it is okay if you're afraid or anxious or sad or scared about climate. We don't have to deride ourselves for feeling ways about climate change. But that what my activists report and that what I see happen in practice is that if you find people to talk about it with in whatever way looks right for you, it doesn't mean you have to go be an activist. It doesn't mean you have to go join a climate activist group, but in feeling a sense of solidarity, people do report feeling better. So I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not going to say I have a cure to climate anxiety. That's not my research. That's not what I do. But I just want to give a practical takeaway that it's okay if you're anxious about the climate. It's totally valid. It's totally reasonable. But there are other people out there that feel like you, and it might be helpful to find them and talk about it because it sort of creates a shared sense of solidarity and that we're in it together. So that is, I think, the end. Thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate it. And thanks for giving me your lunch. I know a lot of you are already in a lot of classes and you're getting talked at all day. So thanks for hanging out during lunch. I'm happy to take any questions anyone might have.
And I'm happy to pass around the microphone. Thank you so much. And that was such an interesting topic, and I will pass it out in a second. But I would love to hear from the climate activists in the room how they related to this presentation and how they feel about it. I saw a few hands. Sarah,
yeah, I had a question. Do you think that this pattern you noticed amongst young climate activists is more effective at climate solutions and kind of that discovery and implementation than other climate groups that you mentioned that you didn't study?
Interesting. So I think it would be hard for me to speak to other groups that I didn't study. One of the things I will say that is sort of unexplored and would need to be a longer temporal project is that even though this was the emotional culture, I did watch a lot of burnout. So, they were able to kind of find these emotional support spaces, but activists also did frequently burn out. Even this movement org, you could argue, has kind of fizzled out since they were really popular and big in 2019, 2020 for a lot of reasons, not just for this reason. But regardless, I think one of the things that's interesting about it is it allowed them to do the work that they wanted to do. And that's part of what emotional culture is about, is that it structures your ability to mobilize. It also conditions what you're able to and unable to talk about. So one quick example is there's another group that's more focused on like this holistic kind of version of climate, thinking about, the different levels of extinction. It's hard to not exactly name the organization. They have a different ethos. They have a different kind of idea about what they're studying, what they're focused on. And I had a climate activist go there and say, I didn't feel heard because it was a lot about animals and I'm not super interested in animals. And I want to do this with the activists that sort of see this as I see it. So when you go to another group you're not in, you might feel a little weird because it's not your emotional culture. But when you come back, you speak with people that are like-minded, that are pickled in that same brine that you are, it feels a little bit more natural. So I don't know if it's like better or worse. It's just sort of different. And that's part of that like nuanced differences that I mentioned at the end, where one climate group has a different understanding of who they are, what they're doing, what the problem is. And those understandings all impact the emotional culture of that group and how it gets shaped and reformed. So it's a really good question. I think the answer is a little bit gray there, but definitely something that could be explored further.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think you're onto a really good set of insights about how activism in general works. I think that cultivated optimism is probably in a lot of has manifestations in a bunch of different groups. And I take that quote from Mia, and it wouldn't surprise me if you presented that and said, this is from an interview with an insurrectionist at the Capitol. When we asked them why they were why did they come here? So thank you.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And I think is something to explore is like, is this a process that kind of be talked about across groups? And I think you're right. When you hit on something that I'm really passionate about, and it's kind of weird, but in social movement studies, we often only study left movements, and people think you need to study left movements different than right movements. I actually fundamentally disagree with that. I think we need to be studying right movements because we can't understand like the spectrum of movements if we're not studying these movements as a collective scholarship. So you're picking on something that I really agree with, and that we need to do better at kind of exploring the nuances of those movements as well, and not just othering them as totally different, uncomparable, crazy town. We have to really engage with them or else we can't understand them. This is a great point.
I will say that it's like really strange for like to be part of the like group that you're talking about studying, because I've done work with Fridays for Future in New York City, and like it was interesting for me to notice like you talking about like the whole finding the hope and even like the joy and using it to like move on. Because when I helped organize we had a global strike this March, and like we took the Brooklyn Bridge, we had 2,500 people. It was really amazing. And at the end, all the activists got together that had planned it and were like, wow, this is really amazing. This is why we're doing the work. And it's like, it was kind of this moment of like, we had spent months like being really like, this is terrible. Like, why are we doing this? Like all these terrible things in the world are happening. Is anything going to change? And then we like got to that moment and realizing it, like, yes, we're fighting for change, but it was also that like communal setting that like gave us that opportunity. And then also one thing I noticed with you said we train based on like what are good stories. And I've seen a shift very recently into good stories or stories that focus more on MAPA, most affected people and places.
Yep.
And like I saw that with the March strike, like people were most moved when you hear people that are firsthand impacted by those things. We had people speak about the North Brooklyn pipeline because there are people that like are in New York City developing asthma because of these pipelines. And I found that those can be more like hearing those firsthand accounts helps us be less removed. Because one thing I was going to ask is one thing that I've seen be a problem is that people in America often feel like they're so removed from the consequences of climate change. And at least in my I grew up in like a privileged suburb, and like I was one of the most involved people in my town. I would go into New York City to do my activism, and like getting people to care when they're so removed. Did you see anything with like how people approach that with their storytelling?
Definitely. Yeah. I think that was part of the purpose of storytelling, actually, in fact, is to draw people in. So the benefit of storytelling as a tactic is that it's really flexible and interactional. So when you're telling a story, you're engaging with your audience in a really unique way. It's actually what's so fascinating about storytelling is it's this give and take. It's not just me, blah, blah, blah. It's us doing something together collectively. So people use storytelling to draw audience members into the problem, into their struggle. Their struggle becomes our struggle. I think that's a really good point. I also ran up into that. I had a lot of conversations with climate activists who are like, I don't know how to make this more clear to people that it affects them. And there were ways like, this is like a silly example, but there are studies that show like seasonal allergies are linked to climate. And so people were like trying to be like, okay, how can we make this applicable to everybody, no matter where they are, what their location is, if you're in the Midwest, if you're in the Northeast, whatever. So it's definitely a struggle. And that's the struggle with the climate movement as a whole, is it's a global problem that has local particularities. And so to get people kind of invested for these different reasons is a challenge. I'd be happy to talk a little more after about some strategies that my activists use, but it's an ongoing problem for sure.
Hi. This was super interesting and I think really resonated with me as someone who's like done storytelling trainings, been storytelling trained. I often think about kind of how turning fear into action can be incredibly empowering and saving.
Yeah.
Just, you know, like, okay, I'm not, like one of the interviewees said, I'm not going to be sitting in my room, I'm going to be doing something.
Yeah.
But I also think that sometimes it can have a sanitizing effect on actual fear. And I was wondering, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not a reason to do it. It's just that kind of weighing those two things. So I was wondering if you thought about that in your research, if the activists you're interviewing talked about it at all.
It's so important to bring that up. That's sort of where I started to go with the burnout thing. Is like, I don't know that this is necessarily what I would say is like the solution to climate anxiety, right? Like there's a whole lot that goes into moving from this fear, and that kind of does what you're saying, which is sanitizing it, wrapping it up in a bow and kind of putting it in this place of hope, especially when you're an outsider. My young activists would always be like, it drives me crazy when my parents are like, you give me so much hope, because it's like, well, go do something. Like, I'm not here to be a generator of hope for you. That's not what I'm here for. So there's a lot that gets packed into hope. Hope is also tied into naivety. People often like talk about hope and naivety in the same space. So it's a really good question. I would say that it's definitely a piece, and it's something that my activists did note and kind of deal with. But I think it's sort of that you just kind of did it in real time. It's like, well, is it not worth doing? But it's real. But what do we do if we don't do it? So I don't think there's like a necessarily like a yes or no. It's more that's correct. And so how does that play out in practice, which is really interesting. Yeah.
Thanks, Anne. And this is maybe tied to the prior question. One thing I was wondering about is whether, or perhaps this is too big or sprawling of a question, but to what extent do particular emotional cultures tend to map on particular kinds of strategies and tactics? You know, I'm supervising a thesis this semester on Earth First, so thinking a lot about the strategies and tactics of sabotage. We could say they were reckless. We could also say they're deeply courageous. In their tactics. And so I'm wondering, is like, does cultivated optimism lead or accompany certain kinds of tactics and strategies? Would perhaps, you know, strategies of sabotage and so forth, it emerge from different kinds of emotional cultures?
I love this question. It's actually a fundamental question of social movements literature, which actually is sort of a chicken and egg question. Which comes first, the culture or the tactics? We're constantly trying to figure that out. So I think emotional culture is often followed by or emotional culture in general, whether it's with the climate movement or with other movements, is often followed by and accompanied by certain kinds of tactics. I think the real question is, are those tactics structured by the emotional culture, or are the emotional culture structured by the tactics? I would argue that culture is much more structuring than we give it credit for. And that in many ways, the emotional culture shapes the landscape of tactics, like repertoires of contention that activists are able to engage with. And if a tactic doesn't make sense within an emotional culture, it may be that activists aren't able to use it because it doesn't jive with their understanding of who they are, what they do, how they feel. So I think that's a fantastic question. Some scholars who are structural analysts would say it's structure, tactics go with culture. I'm a little bit more of a cultural scholar, so I would say in some ways emotional culture shapes the tactics. I think I saw one question in the back. Yeah.
Fascinating presentation. Thank you. I was wondering what the time scale is of the fear that's associated or perceived. For example, in one of the quotes, it was like, the world will fall apart in my lifetime, and I'll be there to see the consequences of the world's falling apart, and I exist thereafter. How does that time scale of the fear or the crisis play out in this idea of how I respond to it? How do I have hope for it? How does that shape the cultural movement? And like, what is the lifetime of the movements themselves?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And this is actually a thing in the literature that's picked up a lot of steam, this like temporality of climate. There's this really fantastic book by Rob Nixon, who's actually a literary scholar, about slow violence. And it's about how the environmental crises that we're experiencing unfold in this very slow temporal state, which makes it really challenging to understand them in the now, which actually speaks to the question that was asked up here about how to make this matter to people now. It unfolds on this time scale that's almost imperceptible to all of us. We are a blip in the climate, like we are a blip in our changing climate. So that's actually what makes climate such a challenging problem, is it exists and operates and changes on a time scale that many of us have a hard time sort of situating ourselves in, because we end up being like this little dot on the whole wall behind me. So with these activists, I think it's a varied time scale. It's oftentimes a here and now, but it's also this is, I could go off here, but there's this whole idea of like post-apocalyptic thinking and how it can be generative for utopian thinking. This is from scholars who are thinking about climate on a temporal scale. And so what they argue is that, post-apocalyptic thinking, while sort of puts our time on Earth as limited, allows us to generate utopias and think about what's next for humanity. And so while it seems negative, actually also generates this different kind of hope around what we could be. I would say these activists are often operating on a time scale where it's like, we know this is happening, maybe not to us right now, but we're going to have to deal with the consequences in our lifetime. I cannot tell you, actually, no one has to answer this, but I would be curious, because this is something I heard even from students here. How many students are like, I'm not having kids? They're like 18 years old and they're like, I'm not having kids. I'm not doing this. This is not a world I want to bring anyone into. 18, they're already thinking that way. So I think it's like both the now and what do we do? How do we act right now? But then also the future, like I have to deal with this. I have to figure this out. This is something that people have left to our generations, whether that's Gen Z or millennials, to kind of sort out. So I think it's a multi-scalar time, but time is, I don't know kind of where the question came from, but time is like the hot topic in sociology right now. Everyone's obsessed with the question of time. So you're asking the right question. It's a really interesting question.
So speaking of time, the bad news is that we are past 1 o'clock, so we have to leave it there. The good news is that Anne is now full-time here at Tufts. So come to visit her at the Office of Sustainability, and us, we're in the same office. And we are in Barnum 234.
238. Yeah,
238. So come talk to her if you want to learn more about this. And let's thank Anne one more time for the wonderful presentation.
I'll also hang out. I might get pizza if there's pizza allowed, and I'll hang out if people want to talk. So if anybody has questions that weren't answered, I'll be here.
And also I wanted to add, if you're interested about activism, we have one more talk coming up next week. This one is about health equity and climate change, and also how to organize for change. So if you're interested in this topic with a new twist, come back next week and we'll hear from actually a physician which I think will be the first time in the 11 years we have been doing that we have a real doctor. So I'll see you next week.